Hey, what's up? Today I'll talk about Sontag's on photography a little more, and just like the previous video I did about this book, I'll assess whether the material is still relevant or needs revising. The first idea I wanted to discuss from this last bit of the first chapter was her analysis of how photography can stir moral outrage. Sontag recounts her own experience when looking at Don McCullin's photographs of Biafra in the early 70s and how they were less impactful than Werner Bischoff's images of the Indian famine from the 50s. Sontag claims that quote-unquote photographs shock insofar as they show something novel. In this case, the power of the Biafra photographs was lessened because people have already seen something similar 20 years prior. There's a few considerations to how an image might affect an individual that are worth going over here. The novelty of a subject is in the eye of the beholder, and this experience is mediated by a number of other factors I'll outline. There are three timelines at play here with how this shock is experienced. These timelines interact with one another in a way that shouldn't be reduced to a mere inversely proportional relationship between moral outrage and exposure to graphic photographs. While Sontag does not do this, that is to say, reduce the relation between moral outrage and exposure to images, I suspect some readers could potentially draw this simplistic, misguided conclusion. So let's talk about these three timelines. The first timeline, of course, is of the particular event itself. To make it more tangible and simple, I'll use the First World War as an example. The second timeline that has to be superimposed to it is that of photography itself. The way humans reacted to photographs in its glorious early years, to quote Sontag, is very different to how they were weaponized and perceived in the 70s or manipulated and recontextualized today. The final timeline to be superimposed is that of the individual looking at a photograph. While no immediate correlation can be ascertained between age and reaction, we can all surely agree that looking at a photograph as a kid is very different to looking at the same photograph while you're a grown-up, right? You're going to be more shocked as a kid. Maybe. So when Sontag says that images transfix, images anesthetize, and uses the example of how she thinks photographs of concentration camps by the 70s had lost their power, quote, after 30 years, a saturation point may have been reached. In these last decades, quote-unquote concerned photography has done at least as much to deaden conscience as to arouse it, end quote. Okay, this might seem a little ironic since she is specifically referring to how photography relates to time, but this relation to time is still valid for photography today as it was in the 70s when this book was published. So here it's not a case of whether it still holds true or needs revising, but rather I do not agree. Sontag blames photography for deadening or anesthetizing conscience. While photography is part of the equation, it is actually exposure to it that is specifically responsible for this. And exposure is more or less within our control. As an intellectual and photography theorist, Sontag was exposed to more images than the average person, even if they were an avid news consumer. So the way a subject aged in her mind is not necessarily representative of how other people might have experienced it. If we go back briefly to the three timelines, there is one more all-pervasive element I'd like to discuss that Sontag actually brings to the table in this chapter. It is ideology. Even though it might be impossible to quantify it in this three-way interaction, we have very different takes on where it is most significant. I'm gonna go ahead and embed it first to the representation of the event itself through photography and other media. The way the First World War was written about and how the world looked at it was a cultural event. Photography itself also developed and was experienced differently by each culture, mediated by their own biases and pre-photographic ideas. And finally, each person relates to photographic representations based on their own individual upbringing and experiences. If we want to assess the way a photograph shocks an individual, these four elements have to be considered. Let me know if you can actually think of an extra element down in the comments below, and that is not a way of trying to get some engagement. I'm genuinely curious. Sontag involves ideology in an interesting way in this interaction. I always thought of the involvement of ideology as the main currency with which these three timelines work with one another. She thinks of it as an enabler for this interaction to even take place. Let's quote her and then unpack her idea. Quote, "Though an event has come to mean precisely something worth photographing, it is still ideology in the broadest sense that determines what constitutes an event. There can be no evidence, photographic or otherwise, of an event until the event itself has been named and characterized. And it is never photographic evidence which can construct, more properly identify, events. The contribution of photography always follows the naming of the event." This quote ties in with her idea that photographs cannot create a moral position, but they can reinforce one and can help build a nascent one. I am not entirely sure I agree with the order she suggests here, specifically about ideology. Strictly speaking, an event doesn't have to be classified for it to be photographed. However, the photographs of an event that has been identified and characterized will always have more profound and longer lasting impact than untethered photos of a war zone, for example. The most limiting condition of this whole idea is that it can only be applied to photojournalism. There is a huge body of photographic work that cannot fit within this hierarchical order. Images that do not deal with historical events and are not about politics. Okay, so before I get into a muddy area here, I do agree that all art is political, okay? I just don't think that all art is about politics. We could discuss this relationship in a different video. I think it probably deserves its own video. So to summarize our different takes on ideology, Sontag thinks that ideology first and foremost constitutes what an event is, and the consideration of whether it is worth photographing comes later. I fully agree with this particular relationship between event and ideology, and this point still very much holds true today. Sontag, however, doesn't dig into how ideology affects relationships that come further down the chain, like how the photographer's particular point of view could have a leaning or be politicized, how the medium proliferating the images can be biased, or how different audiences have different readings of different photographs within different contexts. This doesn't mean that she doesn't think these are factors in the way photographs raise moral conscience, but she just decides not to even mention them in this particular chapter. I think that ideology's role within these interactions lower down the chain are more incidental to the power of images in this instance. Sontag touches on all these elements in a much more elegant way, actually, by writing in first person about her own experience. Quote, "For me, it was photographs of Bergen-Belsen and Dachau, which I came across by chance in a bookstore in Santa Monica in July 1945. Nothing I have seen in photographs or in real life ever cut me as sharply, deeply, instantaneously. Indeed, it seems plausible to me to divide my life into two parts. Before I saw those photographs, I was 12, and after, though it was several years before I understood fully what they were about." End quote. And like that, she summarizes how individual the experience of photography can be. Sontag was born to Jewish parents, and while she didn't have a religious upbringing, I have to wonder whether once she understood what the photos were about, their impact became more significant or personal. Anyhow, in this sense, photography is still very much relevant as a medium to irrevocably shock an individual. The next point she writes about has to do with photography as an instrument of information. Quote, "Photographs were enrolled in the service of important institutions of control, notably the family and the police, as symbolic objects and as pieces of information. Thus, in the bureaucratic cataloging of the world, many important documents are not valid unless they have affixed to them a photograph token of the citizen's face." End quote. This again, at least for now, still holds true. We are still requested to show photo IDs to go into certain venues or for certain kinds of applications or to book check-in into a hotel, right? China, however, has been testing digital IDs in more than a dozen cities since 2018. And residents can actually use their smartphones to check in, to do everything that you'd need an ID for. They've been using facial recognition technology for authentication, which was traditionally the purpose of having a photograph attached to an ID. So this function of photography might be on its way out. I mean, facial recognition in China must be on a different level. Finally, Sontag ends the chapter with two very interesting observations. The first one is that photography, since it can only show the surface of the world, it can only communicate a form of pseudo-knowledge, but never understanding. Quote, photography implies that we know about the world if we accept it as the camera records it. But this is the opposite of understanding, which starts not from accepting the world as it looks. All possibility of understanding is rooted in the ability to say no. Strictly speaking, one never understands anything from a photograph. End quote. According to her, understanding depends on narrative, something photography can never concretely provide. Still holds painfully true. The last part of this chapter that I'll discuss is very specific to how photographs have, more than ever, affected global Western culture in the last decade. Quote, by furnishing this already crowded world with a duplicate one of images, photography makes us feel that the world is more available than it really is. Needing to have reality confirmed and experience enhanced by photographs is an aesthetic consumerism to which everyone is now addicted. Industrial societies turn their citizens into image junkies. It is the most irresistible form of mental pollution. End quote. Still holds true, even though videos are kind of replacing that right now for reasons I already discussed in the first video of this chapter. Instagram wasn't around maybe 35 years after the book was published, but it's kind of eerie how she seems to be specifically talking about our social media experience. Anyway, hope this was all somewhat insightful. We'll soon start with chapter 2. Much love. Juan out. Bye.